What else can I tell you about unions? Daniel, what else do you want to hear about unions? In the private sector, I'm a believer that, I don't see anything wrong with unions per se, particularly in the early days of capitalism, where, there was a lot of questions about, just informational questions about what's an appropriate wage, particularly if you maybe in a small community, you're a little away from the major cities where there's a lot of competition. There's a certain fraternity, particularly in a world that's not very well connected like the 19th century, particularly maybe in a world where, again, you may be in a smaller location. There might be benefits, particularly if the union is truly focused on education, advancement, information, making the employee better. Because remember, in terms of wages in the private sector, I'm not going to get into it, in terms of wages in the public sector, there's only one way for wages to go up that's sustainable. And that is to increase productivity. So imagine if unions were interested in working with managers to bring about sustained, effective increases in productivity, and were willing to participate in those kind of discussions and thoughts and share their experience from the shop floor and how productivity can be enhanced. And there's an immense value you can learn from employees in terms of productivity enhancement and giving them more responsibilities and so on. That would be a great thing that a union could facilitate. But unfortunately, again, in the private sector, it's rare that unions act like that. Unions are far more focused on the Jeff sold his spare body parts for today's show. Thank you, Jeff. We appreciate the sacrifice. I don't think Nancy Pelosi appreciates the sacrifice, but I appreciate the sacrifice. I'm kidding. We don't believe in sacrifice here. So, if you want to use PayPal, it's really easy. Just go to paypal.com and make a payment to Yaron Brook Show. It's fairly easy to do. Or you could go to my website, yaronbrookshow.com/support, where you can sign up for a monthly contribution or make a one-time contribution. Right? Jeff might have had 3 kidneys, so he gave one, so he still got 2, so it's fine. Who knows? Unions are focused on power, and unions from, unfortunately, very early on, from the 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave them political power, that is, gave them political preferential power over employers. They have been advocates of the Democratic Party, have advocated for a particular political agenda. I don't think union members in the last few elections necessarily have voted Democratic. I think many of them voted for Trump. But the union leadership is involved. Unions also, because of the kind of power that they had, particularly in their heyday in the 40s and 50s, were very much involved in organized crime. I think that comes from having that kind of power. It's corrupting. What was that movie with Robert De Niro recently about the killing of Jimmy Hoffa, and you saw the unions and the mafia, hand in hand, working together? Because that's what power attracts. It attracts violence. It attracts a gun. I mean, we're not talking about economic power. We're talking about political power. The power to manipulate and the power to control politicians. So, The Irishman. Thank you, Diego. Absolutely. The Irishman. And thank you, Michael. The Irishman, a terrible movie, by the way. Terrible, terrible, boring, uninteresting, in my view, movie. And terribly made. Very disappointing. No, it wasn't The Scotsman. It was definitely The Irishman. But very powerful in projecting kind of the way the unions and the mafia went hand in hand. It's not an accident. What happened during the And I'll spend another few minutes on that, and then we have to go to the super chat because there are a lot of super chat questions. It's not an accident. In the 40s and 50s and then in the 60s, unions had immense power. They drove wages up, and they drove wages up above the growth in productivity, which required companies to raise prices, and actually drove prices up, and in many cases drove productivity down. They helped create businesses in America that were unproductive, inefficient, and uncompetitive. And while the rest of the world was trying to recover from World War II, that didn't hurt American businesses because we were building up the rest of the world and we had no competition. But once the Japanese and the Germans got their productivity going, their production going, American business could not compete. The unions, together with, I think, bad management, bad incentives, bad governance, bad tax policy, bad attempts at industrial policy in the United States, the Japanese and the Germans kicked our butt. They were far more productive, far more efficient, created better products. I mean, you can see this in the automobile industry primarily. The Germans made better luxury cars. The Japanese made better small cars. We were stuck in the middle. The only thing Americans could do well was SUVs and minivans. And even that edge went away at some point. Unions basically destroyed American business, or helped destroy. They weren't the only cause. There were many other causes. And one of the ways in which the American business recovered post-1970s is by clamping down on unions, breaking them up. Unions were phenomena in many of the conglomerates that were broken up, spun off. Again, a movie I recommend over and over and over again. I encourage you to watch as Other People's Money, where you see this in action. The businesses that had the unions were shut down. They went bankrupt. They were sold off. They shifted production overseas, or they replaced the unions with robots. And American business recovered in the 1980s and into the 1990s as a consequence. And today, union membership in private businesses in the United States is under 9%. Employees realized that to get the good wages, they needed to be more productive. And unions did not help them become more productive, quite the contrary. By raising wages without raising productivity, prices went up. Who paid those prices? Union members. So while their wages went up, their quality of life, what they could buy with their dollars, went down. So the appeal of unions to Americans dramatically declined from the 1970s through today. And you saw this in the defeat of the unionization effort in Amazon, at the Amazon factory in, last week. There's just no appeal to unions, particularly in an era where many of the jobs that used to be unionized are now going to be replaced by robots. Now, I think there'll be plenty of jobs, but you'll always be at the risk that if you drive the cost high enough, you can be replaced, whether by a robot, whether by somebody in Mexico, somebody in Vietnam or China. Deregulation, changing incentives in the corporate structure, a focus on maximizing shareholder wealth and profits, change the dynamics of employment in America and has driven union membership to under 7% in the private sector. It's over 30% in the public sector, under 7% in the private sector, and constantly declining. And unions today represent in the private sector primarily workers in, places like janitorial services and in old line manufacturing jobs like automobiles. But that's disappearing because I don't think Tesla workers are unionized. And American auto companies keep going bankrupt. It's just a question of how many times we want to bail them out. They're not productive. They're not efficient. They shouldn't exist. Maybe in the rail industry. But you know what? There's no unions in Silicon Valley. There are no software engineering unions, and that's the future. There's no computer game creation unions. That's the future. Construction, trucking. But it's less than 7% of private employees. Right?
And to begin with, I wonder if I can ask you to capsulize. I know this is difficult. Can I ask you to capsulize your philosophy? What is Randism?
First of all, I do not call it Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on the concept that reality exists as an objective absolute, that man's mind, reason, is his means of perceiving it, and that man needs a rational morality. I am primarily the creator of a new code of morality which has so far been believed impossible, namely a morality not based on faith.
On faith?
Not on faith, not on arbitrary whim, not on emotion, not on arbitrary edict, mystical or social, but on reason, a morality which can be proved by means of logic, which can be demonstrated to be true and necessary.
All right, all right.
Now, may I define what my morality is?
All right.
Because this is merely an introduction. My morality is based on man's life as a standard of value. And since man's mind is his basic means of survival, I hold that if man wants to live on earth and to live as a human being, he has to hold reason as an absolute, by which I mean that he has to hold reason as his only guide to action, and that he must live by the independent judgment of his own mind, that his highest moral purpose is the achievement of his own happiness, and that he must not force other people, nor accept their right to force him, that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest.
May I?
All right, before we go on, reminder, please like the show. We've got 163 live listeners right now, 30 likes. That should be at least 100. I figure at least 100 of you actually like the show. Maybe there are like 60 of the Matthews out there who hate it. But at least the people who are liking it, you know, I want to see a thumbs up. There you go. Start liking it. I want to see that go to 100. All it takes is a click of a thing, whether you're looking at this. And you know, the likes matter. It's not an issue of my ego. It's an issue of the algorithm. The more you like something, the more the algorithm likes it. So, you know, and if you don't like the show, give it a thumbs down. Let's see your actual views being reflected in the likes. But if you like it, don't just sit there. Help get the show promoted. Of course, you should also share. And you can support the show at JeronBrooksShow.com/support, or on Patreon or Subscribestar or Locals, and show your support for the work, for the value hopefully you're receiving from this. And of course, don't forget, if you're not a subscriber, even if you just come here to troll, or even if you're here like Matthew to defend Marx, then you should subscribe, because that way you'll know when to show up. You'll know what shows are on, when they're on. You'll get notified, right? So, yes, like, share, subscribe, support. Like, share, subscribe, support. There you go. Easy. Do one or all of those, please.